We are standing on the edge of a massive crisis as the legendary Hoover Dam faces an existential threat that is not caused by cracks or explosions. Look at the haunting white bathtub rings stretching across the canyon walls, serving as a grim visual reminder that our largest reservoir is now dying in plain sight. If the water level drops to 895 feet above sea level, the giant turbines will go silent, and the flow of life will be severed forever. This engineering marvel, which cost $6 billion in today's currency, was never designed to operate in a world where the river simply decides to run dry. Over 25 million people, across 3 major states, are now staring into the abyss of a future without power or the water they need for daily survival. The sun scorches the parched ground of the Southwest, while the Colorado River shrinks mile by mile, leaving us to wonder if we have reached the tipping point. When the reservoir reaches the point known as Deadpool, every single city, farm, and industry dependent on this system will be pushed to the brink of disaster. Once a proud symbol of human control over the wild forces of nature, the dam is now transforming into a dark warning about the limits of ingenuity. As we descend into this high-stakes reality, we must ask the one question that everyone is terrified to answer. Is it already too late to save? The shimmering promise on the desert horizon is fading fast as the relentless disappearance of water threatens to unravel an empire built on sand and stone. Thousands of workers toiled under crushing heat during the Great Depression to build this icon, never imagining that the river would one day refuse to follow commands. We are witnessing the beginning of a different kind of failure, one where the steel and concrete remain strong, but the life force within has vanished away. The arithmetic of survival is shifting from delicate to disastrous, as climate change and decades of intense overuse finally catch up with our grandest engineering dreams. Gravity alone will not be enough to push the water through the massive outlets once the reservoir reaches the terrifying depth of 895 feet. Everything we know about the modern American West is currently balanced on a shrinking pool of water that is disappearing into the thin air of the desert. For generations, the Hoover Dam has stood as a shimmering promise on the desert horizon, rising from the chiseled canyons of the Black Canyon to become a vital lifeline. Its story began in the desperate dawn of the 20th century, when cities sprouted from the dust and barren land suddenly became dreams of endless prosperity and rapid growth. Not just Las Vegas, but Phoenix and Los Angeles were hungry for water and power to fuel their expansion into the harshest environments imaginable on this planet today. During the 1930s, workers used over 5 million cubic yards of concrete to seal the Colorado River and create the largest man-made reservoir in the entire country. This melting pot of technology and ambition was built under crushing heat, where men risked their lives daily for the promise of steady pay and a bit of pride. Yet even from the very start, a haunting question lingered in the shadows about what it truly means to gamble on a river in the heart of a desert. What if the flow of the Colorado River, which has always been unpredictable and wild, quietly gave out after decades of serving as the engine of the Western Empire? The scale of the impact is almost impossible to overstate, because it irrigates millions of acres of farmland and generates electricity for more than 25 million people every day. Day and night, the water turns those massive turbines to light up the neon streets of Las Vegas, a city that exists only because of this engineering marvel's strength. Skyscrapers, casinos, and stadiums all owe their existence to the water held back by Hoover Dam, but that security is now facing a threat that no one saw coming. Generations have grown up trusting that the water flowing from their taps and the power in their lights would be reliably secure for at least another 100 years. But now, with the relentless march of drought and overuse, the steady whirl of those turbines faces an existential crisis that could leave the entire region in darkness. Unlike a sudden natural disaster, the risk at the dam accumulates silently over time as the delicate equation of supply versus demand finally begins to collapse under weight. As the climate shifts and the population continues to grow, the $6 billion system starts to look dangerously incomplete because of the limits of the river itself. Was this engineering giant always destined for this crisis? Or is this the first major warning that our gamble with nature is finally reaching its costliest moment? The white bathtub rings are not just mineral deposits, they are the scars of a dying reservoir that tell a story of a world that no longer exists. If we do not listen to the silence of the receding water now, we may soon find ourselves standing in a desert that has reclaimed everything we built. We must realize that the might of engineering can only hold back the tide of nature for so long before the river decides to take its original path. Everyone who follows the fate of the Hoover Dam knows a single ominous number, which is 895 feet above the sea level today. This is not just a random figure, but the exact height where Lake Mead reaches what engineers call the terrifying and final stage of Deadpool. At 895 feet, the gravity is no longer enough to push water through the massive outlets, and the giant turbines go completely silent forever. The Colorado River is no longer tamed by modern engineering, but instead controlled by empty air and the absolute absence of the flowing water today. Water becomes a prisoner behind the concrete wall of the dam, unable to travel downstream to the millions of people who depend on its life force. The consequences of reaching this point are unquestionable, because cities, farms, and industries downstream will be suddenly and violently cut off from their source. Today, the water levels of Lake Mead tell a very uncomfortable story of how the water has vanished inch by inch over the past few decades. Those white bathtub rings serve as visible reminders that our reservoir is shrinking and the climate in the West is no longer a future threat. Every single drop lost inches the entire system closer to that moment when the $6 billion project becomes nothing more than an inert relic. Engineers and water managers monitor these numbers closely as computer models warn of the risks, while the climate continues to grow drier and hotter. For the tourists who visit every day, the massive facade is the focus, but few see the deep tension felt by those who depend on it. Urban dwellers, farmers, and native communities track the daily fluctuations of the reservoir because their very survival depends on what those gauges say every morning. News tickers highlight the low snowpack and runoff shortfalls while parents wonder what kind of thirsty future they are leaving to their young children tonight. The intensifying heat of the Southwest speeds up the evaporation, depleting Lake Mead by millions of gallons every single day before the water reaches any tap. Meanwhile, the century-old legal framework known as the law of the river has overpromised the limited water to 7 states and the nation of Mexico. The arithmetic is shifting from a delicate balance to a total disaster, as the fragility of our empire is masked by the might of engineering. We are racing against a falling reservoir where the numbers do not lie about the slow and relentless disappearance of the water we once took for granted. If the water level continues to drop, the once shimmering oasis of Las Vegas will face a reality that was never imagined by its founding fathers. The system was built for a reality that no longer exists, and we are now forced to face the limits of our own human control today. As we approach the unseen line of Deadpool, the heartbeat of the American West begins to flicker and fade into the dry desert wind tonight. Every foot of water lost is a heartbeat missed in a system that was designed to be immortal, but is now proving to be tragically mortal. Is there any way to halt this march toward destruction? Or are we already too late to change the course of our thirsty and dry history? The answer lies beneath the surface of the shrinking lake, where the silence of the turbines is becoming louder with every passing hour of the day. We must reckon with the fact that nature does not care about our blueprints or the billions of dollars we have poured into the concrete walls. The real weakness of the Hoover Dam is not hidden inside the massive concrete walls or the steel pipes that have stood strong for almost an entire century now. Instead, the fatal flaw lies in our own human vision and the mistaken assumption that the powerful Colorado River would always provide an endless supply of the flowing water. This $6 billion monument was built for a reality of abundance that no longer exists in a world gripped by the relentless and intensifying heat of climate change. When the water level reaches that terrifying line of Deadpool, the hydropower turbines designed to harvest the force of falling water will simply slow down and eventually stop. Imagine waking up to the news that the massive generators have gone silent, leaving millions of homes and businesses across the Southwest without a reliable source of clean electricity. This is not a mechanical failure, but a fundamental mismatch between the ambitious dreams of the American West and the harsh restrictions of the increasingly arid and dry climate. The resulting stillness would trigger waves of blackouts and brownouts, forcing cities like Phoenix and Los Angeles to search for much more expensive and less efficient sources of the energy. Without the steady hum of the Hoover Dam, the entire regional power grid becomes unstable, making it much harder to balance intermittent energy sources like the solar and wind. Factories would go idle, and hospitals would be forced to rely on emergency generators while the backbone of our daily lives begins to crumble under the weight of water scarcity. The investment of nearly $50 million in the 1930s, which is worth billions today, would be rendered completely powerless by the simple absence of the falling water. Once the threshold of Deadpool is crossed, recovery is not swift because the system was never designed to restart without the natural pressure provided by a full reservoir. Experts warn that even the strongest conservation efforts might not be enough to counter the combined effects of rising temperatures and the ongoing overuse of our limited river water. The river that carved the majestic Grand Canyon over millions of years is now shrinking into a shadow of its former self, threatening the very foundations of our modern civilization. As the lights flicker and dim across the desert landscape, we are forced to realize that our control over nature was always just a fragile and very temporary illusion. We have gambled the future of 25 million people on a river that is now failing to deliver the promises we carved so deeply into the ancient canyon stone. The silence of the turbines will be the loudest warning we have ever heard, signaling the end of an era where we thought nature would always obey our commands. The shadow of the Hoover Dam stretches much farther than its physical bounds, reaching into the daily lives of millions across the entire nation through food and electricity. If the water levels drop below the Deadpool line, the chain reaction will hit the massive agricultural fields of the Imperial Valley and the desert farms of Arizona. Known as the winter produce basket of America, these fields rely entirely on the controlled flow of water released through the massive concrete gates of the Hoover Dam. When the water stops flowing, the crop yields will fall, the fields will turn to dust, and the rural jobs that sustain new communities will simply vanish overnight. This is not just a regional issue, because the shortage of fresh produce will cause food prices to skyrocket in grocery stores from New York to San Francisco. The century-old allocation agreements between the 7 states and Mexico will come under extreme strain as natural shortages force painful rationing and bitter legal battles. Scarcity has a way of pushing neighbors from collaboration toward confrontation, as everyone fights for the last remaining drops of the shrinking Colorado River in the west. Beyond the human impact, the desert ecosystems downstream face a total collapse because birds, fish, and plants rely on the carefully timed releases of the cool water. The vital habitats for migratory birds and endangered native fish could disappear forever, leaving a silent and barren landscape where a vibrant river once used to flow. Today, the dam stands as both a proud symbol of our past achievements and a somber warning about the limits of our reach in a drying world. Walk across the top of the dam today, and the scale is still impressive, but the whitening canyon walls tell a story of a reality we cannot ignore. Historians may one day recall the Hoover Dam as the crowning accomplishment of an era that believed every wild resource could be managed and every frontier tamed. But as the reservoir inches down toward that final number of 895 feet, the history and the future of the West are about to collide. Will this massive structure become a gravestone for the reclamation era, or can we find new answers that fit the harsh reality of a much drier world? The future of the Hoover Dam is ultimately a collective test of our human will and our flexibility to adapt before nature takes back the control forever. As the sun sets over the parched horizon, the waterline keeps changing and the wake-up call may come quietly in the measureless silence of the desert. We must decide if we will learn the lessons of adaptation now or wait until the total disruption of our civilization teaches it to us the hard way. The story of the Hoover Dam is still being written foot by foot and day by day in the fate of those 25 million people watching the water.